Every morning before sunrise, in the middle of a snow-covered Chicago winter, Daniel Brooks left a paper bag with a hot coffee and a fresh roll by the side door of Maple Street Cafe. He never spoke to the woman who stood outside in the falling snow. She never asked. She just nodded. Then, one freezing Thursday, the cafe door burst open. A man in a tailored wool coat stepped in, followed by 4 bodyguards shaking snow from their shoulders. He scanned the room once and said, "I'm looking for Daniel Brooks." And suddenly, the quiet kindness Daniel thought no one noticed became something much bigger. The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m. 13 minutes before it was set to. Daniel Brooks had been awake for at least an hour anyway. He lay in the dark of his apartment on the north side of Chicago, listening to the wind pressing against the window glass. A low, sustained sound like something alive trying to get inside. January had arrived this year without negotiation. The meteorologists had called it a polar vortex, which meant nothing to Daniel except that his son's coat wasn't warm enough, and the bus to the cafe took 11 minutes longer than usual because the driver crept through ice-slicked streets at the pace of someone afraid to fall. He got up carefully, trying not to wake Noah. His son slept in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, burrowed so deep under his blankets that only the top of his blonde head was visible. 6 years old and still sleeping like he trusted the world completely. Daniel envied that. He made Noah's lunch while the coffee brewed half a peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, a small bag of crackers, the kind with the cheese dip that Noah called the orange ones. The refrigerator was running low. He'd have to hit the discount grocery on Fullerton after his shift, assuming the bus ran on time. It almost never ran on time in January. He pulled on 2 layers under his jacket, then a third. The walk to the bus stop was 7 blocks, and on a morning like this, 7 blocks in Chicago felt like a different category of distance entirely. He'd been working the morning shift at Maple Street Cafe for 2 years and 4 months. He knew this the way he knew the bus schedule and Noah's kindergarten calendar, not because he kept records, but because certain things anchor themselves to memory when everything else feels like it might drift away. He'd taken the job after the restaurant he'd worked at on the South Side closed without warning, a note on the door and 2 weeks of unpaid wages that he never recovered. Maple Street was different. Caldwell, the owner, was a tired man in his late 50s who ran a tight operation. He didn't talk much, didn't joke, didn't linger, but he paid on time. In Daniel's world, that meant something. The first time Daniel noticed the woman, she was standing at the side entrance, pressed against the brick under the overhang. Snow had settled into the hood of her jacket, a thin, dark thing that looked better suited to October than January. Her shoes, he noticed, were soaked through. Canvas sneakers, the kind teenagers wore in summer. He didn't say anything that morning. He unlocked the side door, went in, and started his prep work. But he looked back through the small window twice before the shift really got going, and both times she was still there. Still, the next morning he brought a paper bag, leftover roll from the previous evening's bake that Caldwell would otherwise have tossed, and a coffee in a to-go cup from the drip machine that Daniel started early before anyone else arrived. He set it beside the door without looking at her directly. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She nodded. That was all. It became the rhythm of their mornings. He arrived, she was there, or she wasn't. When she was, he left the bag. Sometimes a roll and coffee. Sometimes, when he'd bought groceries the night before, a wrapped sandwich, a banana. He used his own money. $14, sometimes $17 a week. It was money he didn't have, technically. His savings account had dropped to $92 the previous month after the last installment of Noah's hospital bill leftover debt from the pneumonia episode the previous winter. When Daniel had sat in an emergency room for 6 hours, listening to his son's labored breathing and thinking about things he couldn't afford to think about, he bought the food anyway. He bought the granola bars himself, from the convenience store 2 blocks from his building, $3.49 a box. He kept them in his jacket pocket and dropped one into the bag each morning, along with whatever came from the cafe. He never counted up the total of what he'd spent over those weeks. He didn't want to know the number. There was a version of himself, he knew, that could explain this away as pragmatic self-interest, good karma, community goodwill, something transactional wrapped in the language of generosity. He didn't think that was what it was. He thought it was simpler and harder to articulate than that. He thought it was just that when you know something is wrong and you can do something about it, and you don't, the doing nothing becomes a thing you carry. He'd been carrying enough already. Then, one Tuesday morning, he went to leave the bag, and she wasn't there. He told himself it was nothing. People moved. People found somewhere else to go. It wasn't his business. He set the bag down anyway, beside the door, in case she came later. Ryan Kowalski, the other morning counter guy, had noticed. Ryan was 24, cheerful in the way of someone who hadn't yet had to carry anything too heavy for too long. He started asking about her around the second week. "The woman out back," he called her. "You know her?" "No," Daniel said. "She here every morning?" "Most." Ryan looked out the window, where the snow had built a small ridge along the sill. "Rough," he said, and then the espresso machine needed attention, and that was the end of it. Caldwell was less comfortable with ambiguity. He caught Daniel refilling a to-go cup one morning, a few minutes before opening, and stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed. "I'm not running a shelter," he said. Not unkindly, exactly. More like a man stating a fact about physics. "It's from my break allowance," Daniel said. And the roll would have gone in the bin. He kept his voice neutral. He didn't need this conversation to become a different conversation. Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. Then he went back into the kitchen. He never brought it up again, but Daniel noticed that the number of rolls going into the evening toss bin increased by 2 or 3 most days after that. He didn't mention this to anyone. What he noticed most about the woman, beyond the inadequate coat and the shoes, were her eyes when he caught them briefly through the fogged side window. Not desperate, not blank. Alert, the kind of alertness that comes from paying very close attention to a world that has recently taught you to. Once, on a morning when the temperature had dropped past -15 with wind chill, Daniel had hesitated at the side door for an extra moment before going in. It was the kind of cold that makes the inside of your nose sting and turns the moisture on your lips to a thin crust before you've walked half a block. He'd looked at her standing under the overhang and thought, whatever has happened to bring this person to this specific corner at this specific hour, it is not a small thing. People do not choose this. They arrive here through a sequence of events that, at any earlier point in the sequence, they would have done anything to avoid. He didn't know her story. He didn't ask. In his experience, when people needed something and you had it to give, the story was usually beside the point. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she slept or why she was there. He left the food because the alternative, walking past and pretending he didn't see, was something he couldn't do. He'd tried it, the very first morning. He'd gone inside, started his prep, made it about 6 minutes before he went back and looked through the window. She was still standing there in the dark. That was really the whole of it. He couldn't explain it more than that. 3 days passed. She didn't come back. It was a Thursday when the door came open. Not the soft push of a regular customer, but a hard swing, the kind that hits the wall-mounted stopper and makes the whole room flinch. Snow followed them in 4 large men in dark coats, shaking it from their shoulders, and then a fifth, who was clearly a different category of person entirely. He was maybe 50, with the posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and having them reorganize around him. His coat was charcoal wool, fitted and expensive. His shoes, even snow-dusted, were clearly not from any store Daniel had ever been inside. The cafe had 4 customers at that hour. All 4 of them stopped what they were doing. The man in the wool coat scanned the room with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Then he looked directly at Daniel behind the counter. "Which one of you is Daniel Brooks?" Ryan took a step back. Daniel set down the portafilter he was holding. "That's me." The man walked to the counter. He placed a business card on the laminate surface and slid it forward. Daniel picked it up. The paper was heavy and cream-colored. The kind of card that communicated, by texture alone, that the person who'd ordered it was accustomed to things that cost more than they needed to. Jonathan Pierce, attorney at law. Pierce, Holt, and Carmichael. "I represent a client named Olivia Whitman," the man said. "I believe you know her." Daniel didn't recognize the name. He said so. Pierce reached into his coat and produced a photograph. It was glossy, printed on high-quality paper, a woman at some kind of fundraising event, dressed in a dark gown, standing beside a podium. She was smiling at whoever was taking the picture, and her hands were folded in that particular way of someone who has attended many such events and knows where to put her hands for photographs. Daniel looked at the photograph for a long moment. He recognized her eyes. "There's a matter," Pierce said quietly, "that my client needs to discuss with you. If you're willing, we'd like a few minutes of your time." Privately, Caldwell appeared in the kitchen doorway. Daniel glanced at him. Caldwell gave a nearly imperceptible nod that meant, "Handle it, but make it fast." They went to the small storage room at the back, between the walk-in and the emergency exit. It smelled like coffee grounds and industrial cleaner. There was barely enough room for 2 people, let alone 6. The bodyguards waited outside. Pierce sat on a crate and laid a folder across his knee like this was the most normal place in the world to have a conversation. Pierce spoke carefully, the way lawyers do when they're choosing which facts to present in which order for maximum comprehension and minimum misunderstanding. "Olivia Whitman," he explained, "was the daughter of Edward Whitman, who had died 8 months earlier. Edward Whitman had built a logistics company over 40 years, trucking, warehousing, distribution contracts across the Midwest, and at the time of his death, it was worth considerably more than most people in a neighborhood like this would find easy to imagine. His will had been specific. 60% of the estate, including control of the charitable foundation the family had run for 3 decades, went to Olivia. The remainder to her older brother, Marcus. Marcus had contested the will within 2 weeks of the funeral. He claimed their father lacked capacity at the time of signing, Pierce said. The claim has no legal merit, but it created an injunction that froze Olivia's access to her accounts and assets while the matter was being litigated. That injunction has been in place for 6 months, Pierce went on. The picture that emerged was not complicated, and its outline inheritance disputes rarely are, but its details were. Marcus had moved quickly after the funeral, before Olivia had recovered enough from the death of her father to fully understand what was happening. The injunction had been granted on the basis of a petition that Pierce described, with barely restrained precision, as creatively drafted. The judge who granted it had since recused himself from the case for reasons Pierce declined to specify. Daniel absorbed this. So she has no money. Technically, she has a great deal of money. She simply cannot access any of it. She has a small amount of personal cash she'd kept separate from the estate, enough for a few months of basic expenses, but it ran out in November. She's been staying in rotating arrangements since then. Friends, acquaintances. But Marcus hired investigators. Anyone who assisted her was approached. The pressure made it difficult for people to continue helping. Approached, Daniel said. Pierce nodded. He didn't elaborate, and his expression made clear that elaboration wasn't necessary. Olivia chose to remain anonymous during this period. She believed correctly, as it turned out that being traceable would only give Marcus additional leverage. She didn't tell anyone her real name, including you. She wants me to apologize for that, in her words. What does she need from me? Pierce opened the folder. The court date is in 3 weeks. The primary argument being made against Olivia is that she is unstable, isolated, and incapable of managing the foundation's responsibilities. Marcus's legal team has assembled a narrative. To counter it, we need witnesses who interacted with her during this period. People who can speak to who she actually is, how she carries herself, whether she exhibited signs of the instability being claimed. He paused. You are the only person, in 6 months, who helped her consistently, without knowing who she was, without any transaction involved. You're the only person, Mr. Brooks, whose assistance carries no possible appearance of self-interest. Daniel looked at the photograph again. The woman at the podium. The woman in the thin coat. I need to think, he said. The anonymous call came 2 days later. No caller ID. A man's voice, not threatening exactly, but shaped in a way that communicated threat without saying anything that could be transcribed and used against him. He mentioned the cafe. He mentioned Noah's school. He didn't make any specific statements. He didn't need to. 3 days after that, a food safety inspector arrived at Maple Street Cafe at 7:15 the morning, before the first real rush, with a clipboard and the particular expression of someone sent to find something whether or not it was there. He spent 2 hours going through the walk-in, the prep area, the hand-washing stations. He cited the cafe for a temperature discrepancy in one of the reach-in coolers, a variance of 2 degrees, and left a notice requiring a follow-up inspection within 10 days. Caldwell said nothing to Daniel directly. But the way he moved through the kitchen that afternoon, deliberate, contained, not looking at anyone, communicated something clearly enough. He told himself it was probably unrelated, that food safety inspections happened, that cafes got cited for temperature variances all the time. He was mostly able to believe this by focusing on the work in front of him, the prep list, the cleaning rotation, the order form that was due by Thursday. He was mostly able to believe it until he pulled up the city's online inspection portal that night and found that Maple Street Cafe's last scheduled inspection was not due for another 7 months. He closed the browser tab and sat looking at nothing for a while. Ryan started taking his breaks at the front of the cafe instead of the back, where he and Daniel usually stood together by the delivery door. He didn't explain this. He didn't have to. Daniel sat at his kitchen table that night after putting Noah to bed and looked at his bank balance on his phone. $92. There was rent in 11 days. There was the follow-up payment on Noah's hospital balance, which the billing office had already extended twice. There was the cost of Noah's school field trip, $22, due Friday, which he had been trying to figure out since the permission slip came home. He set the phone face down on the table. Noah appeared in the hallway in his pajamas, squinting against the kitchen light. Dad? Are we moving? No. Why? Jonah at school said his family's moving because they can't pay for their apartment. We're not moving. Go back to bed. Noah stood there for another few seconds in the way that 6-year-olds do when they're deciding whether to believe something or keep asking questions. Then he went back to his room. Daniel sat in the kitchen until past midnight. He went through the numbers 3 different ways, as though the arithmetic might change if he approached it from a different angle. It didn't. He thought about calling Pierce and declining, saying it was too much, saying he had a kid, he had a job he couldn't afford to lose, he had no savings and a hospital bill that wasn't going away. All of this would have been entirely true. He thought about the woman in the thin coat, standing in the snow at 5 a.m, not asking anyone for anything, just standing there. He thought about what he would want, if it were ever Noah out there someday, in a different version of this world, with the wrong coat and the wrong shoes and no one looking. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark listening to the radiator knock and hiss and to Noah breathing quietly in the next room. Outside, snow fell again, because it was January in Chicago, and that was what January in Chicago did. He thought about a lot of things. He thought about his mother, who had worked 2 jobs for most of his childhood, and who had said, more than once, that the only thing you really own is the kind of person you decide to be. He'd thought of that as a bit sentimental when he was younger. He understood it differently now. He thought about the morning 3 years ago when Noah was in the hospital with pneumonia, and a nurse named Beverly had pulled a chair up beside Daniel in the waiting room at 2 a.m, and sat with him for 20 minutes without saying a single word. He hadn't thanked her, not properly. He didn't have the words at the time. He thought about the way people talk about doing the right thing as though it were always obvious and cost-free, when in practice it is almost never either of those things. He got up at 4:30, made coffee, and sat at the table until the light in Noah's room clicked on at 6. He got Noah up, made breakfast, walked him to the bus stop, watched the bus pull away in the gray morning light. Then he walked back inside, picked up his phone, and dialed the number on Pierce's card. Pierce answered on the second ring. "Tell me what I need to do," Daniel said. The Daily Center was a building that took itself seriously. Daniel had been inside it once before, for a parking dispute that had taken 4 hours to resolve and gone nowhere. He wore his good jacket, the one he kept for job interviews. It was slightly too light for the weather and slightly too formal for who he was, but it was the best thing he had, so he wore it. Pierce had briefed him twice in the preceding week, once in person, in a conference room that smelled like leather and old books, and once by phone the night before. Pierce was precise and thorough in the way of someone who had spent a long career making sure other people understood exactly what was going to happen before it happened. "They're going to try to establish motive," Pierce had said. "They'll suggest you knew who she was, that the kindness was a long game. Stay factual. What you did, when you did it, what you observed. Nothing you can't verify." Daniel had nodded. Marcus Whitman sat at the respondent's table with 2 attorneys flanking him like expensive furniture. He was around 40, tan in the way of someone who had not spent January in Chicago, with the cultivated ease of a person whose life had not required much in the way of visible effort. He didn't look at Daniel when Daniel walked in. This struck Daniel as deliberate. Olivia was seated on the far side of the room, composed in a way that Daniel recognized the particular composure of someone holding themselves very carefully together. She was dressed simply, professionally, and she looked nothing like the woman in the thin coat. She looked exactly like the woman in the photograph. She met Daniel's eyes across the room and held them for a moment. He nodded once. She nodded back. Marcus's lead attorney was a woman named Diane Carver, who had the particular skill of making reasonable-sounding questions feel like they were doing something else entirely. She established Daniel's employment status, his income, his financial situation with an efficiency that left no doubt about what she was implying. She asked about Noah, how old he was, what his school was like in a tone of friendly interest that made the hair on Daniel's arms rise. "And you say you had no idea who Miss Whitman was during the period in question," Carver said. "That's correct. And yet you provided food and beverages to this individual, a stranger over a period of several weeks, at your own expense, without ever speaking to her or asking her name." "Yes, that strikes many people as unusual, Mr. Brooks. Can you explain the reasoning?" He'd thought about this moment. Pierce had warned him it would come. He'd rehearsed several answers, all of them more precise, more legal-sounding. In the moment, he set them aside. "Because she was cold," he said. "And no one else was doing anything about it." Carver waited, as though there might be more. There wasn't. What broke the case open, in the end, wasn't Daniel's testimony. It was the evidence Pierce introduced in the following session audio recordings that had been gathered by a private investigator hired by Olivia's legal team during the months of litigation. Phone calls in which a coordinator working for Marcus's attorneys discussed the timing of the food safety inspection. A text thread documenting payment to an individual described only as the contact at the ward office. A voicemail, inadvertently preserved, in which a man whose voice analysis matched one of Marcus's associates made reference to the guy at the coffee place in a context that admitted no innocent interpretation. Carver objected to the admissibility of several items. The judge ruled on each, methodically, in a voice that communicated neither drama nor satisfaction. By the end of the afternoon session, the court had issued a request for a formal investigation into interference with witnesses in the case. Marcus Whitman, for the first time since Daniel had entered the room, looked like a man who had just been made aware of how far the ground was below him. Daniel sat in the corridor afterward, still in his good jacket, watching people move through the marble lobby. A security guard by the entrance stood with his arms folded, watching nothing. A woman in a gray coat hurried past with a stack of folders. Two men in suits talked in low voices near the elevator bank. The kind of low-voiced conversation that is really just regular volume but made to look confidential. Pierce came out of the hearing room and found him there. He sat down in the chair beside Daniel and did not say anything for a moment, which was unusual for Pierce. "You did well," Pierce said, finally. Daniel nodded. "The answer you gave about why you did it, that wasn't what I advised." Pierce's voice carried no judgment, just observation. "I know," Daniel said. Pierce looked out at the lobby for a moment. "It was better," he said. Then he stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the elevator. The investigation took 5 weeks. Daniel knew this in the way that people know things they read about in passing a headline glimpsed on a screen at the cafe, a mention from Pierce in a brief check-in call. He didn't follow it closely. He had a shift to work and a kid to raise and a follow-up inspection to get through. The re-inspection came and went without incident. The cooler had been fixed. The inspector was a different person this time, a woman with a brusque efficiency who wrote her notes, checked her boxes, and left in under 40 minutes. Caldwell acknowledged this to Daniel with a brief nod in the kitchen. That was the full extent of the conversation. Marcus Whitman's legal standing deteriorated with a speed that surprised even Pierce, who told Daniel this in a phone call in late February with the measured tone of a man who had learned not to celebrate too early. The investigation into witness interference led to the discovery of a pattern of coordinated pressure applied to multiple parties in the case: Olivia's former colleagues, a family acquaintance who had briefly offered her housing, a property manager. The will contest was withdrawn by Marcus's attorneys on a Tuesday afternoon, citing unspecified, changed circumstances. It was reported in 3 business publications and 1 general interest news outlet. Daniel did not read any of these. He heard about it from Ryan, who had returned to taking his breaks at the back door without comment, and who showed Daniel a brief item on his phone with the energy of someone delivering news he wasn't sure how to frame. "Is that the same woman?" Ryan asked. "Yes," Daniel said. Ryan looked at the phone for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and went back inside. Maple Street Cafe stayed closed for 2 days during the re-inspection process. When it reopened, Caldwell was quieter than usual, which was saying something. Daniel worked his shift, cleaned the machines, closed up, and took the bus home in the dark. Olivia Whitman called Daniel directly, 6 days after the withdrawal of the will contest. He was in the parking lot of the discount grocery on Fullerton, loading bags into the wire cart he'd borrowed from his neighbor Mrs. Papadimitriou, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. "Mr. Brooks." "This is Olivia Whitman." A pause. "I wanted to call you myself. I'm glad things worked out," he said. "I wanted to apologize for not telling you my name, for putting you in a difficult position without warning you first. You didn't sign up for any of what happened, and I know it cost you." "It's fine," Daniel said. This was not entirely true, but it was close enough to true to say. There was a pause on the line. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, less formal, more direct. "My foundation is launching a program this spring. The Whitman Foundation Winter Initiative Emergency Support for Individuals Experiencing Housing Instability During Winter Months in the Chicago area. We're also building a partnership structure for small food businesses willing to participate in a morning meal program. Cafes, diners, places willing to provide food to people who need it, supported and reimbursed through the foundation." He listened. "Mr. Caldwell's cafe meets all the criteria. The contract would be with him, not with you. I want to be clear about that." This isn't an arrangement designed to benefit you directly. The program will be run through the Foundation's normal grant process, with full documentation and accountability. But I thought you should know it exists. Daniel leaned against the parking lot cart. Across the lot, a minivan was idling in the pickup zone, exhaust curling white in the cold air. The Foundation also administers an emergency medical assistance fund, she said, more carefully. It's means-tested, income verified. Anyone can apply. The process is documented and external reviewers handle the decisions. I have no visibility into individual applications. I mention this only because I know from public records that there was an insurance claim associated with a pediatric hospitalization at your address 18 months ago. He didn't say anything for a moment. It's not charity from me to you, she said. It's a program. It was already being designed. You'd be one case file among hundreds. I understand the distinction, he said. Good. He picked up the grocery cart and started walking toward the bus stop. Thank you for calling. Thank you for answering, she said. The first time, I mean. By the door. He almost said it was nothing. He stopped himself. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't everything either. It was just what he'd done. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, Mr. Brooks. By mid-March, the worst of it was over. The snow was still there. Chicago doesn't let go of winter easily, but it had a different character now. Less fierce. The light in the mornings came earlier and had a quality that was almost apologetic, as if winter itself understood it had overstayed. Caldwell had signed the partnership agreement with the Whitman Foundation in late February. He'd told Daniel about it in his customary way, not a conversation so much as a transfer of information. Standing in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, saying the words once and not repeating them. Starting next week, we're doing morning bags for distribution through the shelter network. 24 per day to start. I'm putting you on that prep slot, 6 to 7, before the regular rush. 20-minute shift extension. Pay goes up accordingly. Daniel had started to say something. Caldwell had turned back toward the kitchen. The rolls are good in the morning, Caldwell said, not looking back. They should go somewhere they're needed. That was the end of the conversation. It was the most words Daniel had ever heard Caldwell say in one stretch about anything that wasn't food, handling, or supply orders. Noah got his field trip money on time. He came home that Friday with a paper bag of magnets shaped like state birds and a long account of everything he'd seen at the Science Museum, delivered at a pace and volume that left no room for questions. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and listened to all of it. On a Thursday morning in the third week of March, Daniel arrived at the cafe at his usual time. He unlocked the side entrance and carried in the first box of supplies from the delivery that had come after closing the night before. There was a man standing near the overhang. He was older, maybe 60, in a coat that was too thin for the weather. He stood the way people stand when they're trying to take up as little space as possible, shoulders slightly curved, weight distributed in a way that said he expected to be told to move along. Daniel went inside. He started the coffee. He got a roll from the morning delivery, wrapped it in paper, poured the first cup from the machine. He went back to the side door, opened it, and set the bag down on the step. He didn't say anything. He went back inside. Through the small side window, fogged with the temperature difference between inside and out, he watched the man pick up the bag. The man stood still for a moment, holding it with both hands, looking at nothing in particular. Then he gave a slow, careful nod to the closed door and walked on. Daniel turned back to the prep counter and started setting up for the morning rush. The morning bags were stacked near the side door now, labeled and ready 24 of them, each with a roll, a small carton of orange juice, and a granola bar. They'd go out with the Shelter Network's morning pickup at 8. Caldwell had ordered new insulated bags for the purpose, which cost more than the standard paper kind. He had not commented on this expenditure. Ryan had started showing up 5 minutes early. This had not been discussed. It had simply begun happening. He and Daniel worked the setup together in the quiet of the cafe before opening, the espresso machine warming up, the chairs still upturned on the tables, light coming gray and early through the front windows. Noah's class had a new teacher's aide starting after spring break, a young woman named Miss Finley, who, according to Noah's detailed and comprehensive report, was good at drawing animals freehand and could do a convincing dinosaur roar, which Noah considered the most important qualification for working with first graders. Daniel had listened to this assessment seriously, as it deserved. The hospital bill had been reduced to a balance that Daniel could, with discipline and a run of good months, actually retire within a year. The letter from the Foundation's external reviewer had used the word approved in the second line, and Daniel had read the rest of it standing over the kitchen sink with his coffee going cold beside him. He hadn't told anyone about that letter. It wasn't the kind of thing he knew how to talk about without it sounding like something other than what it was. And what it was just a thing that had happened and that he was grateful for. That was all. Somewhere in the city, Olivia Whitman was sitting in an office that had been hers since before she could remember, running the numbers on spring programming, figuring out how many people they could reach before the weather turned. Daniel didn't know this. He knew it the way you know things about people you've never fully met, in the way that the shape of a brief exchange, a photograph,